In this episode of Biblical Unlocks, we will go through a chapter of the Bible and make it make sense in your life today. Studies routinely show that reading your Bible regularly significantly lowers symptoms of depression, anxiety, and anger, whilst also increasing forgiveness, compassion, and a sense of purpose. So if you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Enjoy the show. Alright, so today we're going to go through the final chapter of Genesis chapter 50. I'm just going to read it in full because it's important, and this is one of the most important chapters in the entire Bible, and we're going to see one of the most important verses in the entire Bible, which talks about the fall of mankind and how God redeems his people. So, Genesis 50. Then Joseph threw himself on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Just some context. Jacob has died, and Joseph is throwing himself on his father's face because he has just died in Genesis 49. Joseph commanded the physicians in his service to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. They spent 40 days doing this, for that is the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. When the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph addressed the household of Pharaoh. If now I have found favor with you, please speak to Pharaoh as follows. My father made me swear an oath. He said, I'm about to die in the tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. Now therefore let me go up so that I may bury my father. Then I will return. Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. Both chariots and charioteers went up with him. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they held a very great and sorrowful lamentation, and he observed a time of mourning for his father 7 days. When the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning on the part of the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had instructed them. They carried him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, the field near Mamre, which Abraham bought as a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us, and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him? So they approached Joseph, saying, Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers, and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, We are here as your slaves. But Joseph said to them, Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were also born on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, "When God comes to you, you shall carry up my bones from here." And Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Alright, now time for the last biblical unlocks for Genesis. So, verses 1 to 3, what happened? Jacob dies, Joseph weeps over his father, and Joseph commands the Egyptian physicians, the Egyptian doctors, to embalm Jacob in a process which takes 40 days, and there was a 70-day national mourning period, as we saw before. Now, the important thing to remember here is that Joseph deeply respects and honors his father, and Egypt shows massive respect. The country of Egypt, this pagan country, shows massive respect for Jacob because of Joseph's position, how Joseph has helped them along the way. And long mourning signals Jacob's significance again in God's plan. So here again what we're seeing is that God and his covenant family is treated with a level of royal honor in Egypt, and this is actually foreshadowing how God will exalt his people even whilst they live in exile or in foreign lands. In verses 4 to 6, Joseph requests permission to bury Jacob in Canaan. And in fact, Joseph asks Pharaoh for permission. He asks Pharaoh, "Hey, can I bury my father, Jacob? And can I bring him back to the land of Canaan?" And because Joseph actually was instructed by Jacob to do so. So Jacob swore, or Jacob made Joseph swear that he would bring him and bury him in the land of Canaan. And why is that important? Because Jacob's burial in the land of Canaan is again a declaration of faith in God's promise. That is, God promised the land to Jacob, to Isaac, to Abraham, all of the patriarchs. And Joseph is continuing to honor that covenant by returning Jacob to the land that God had promised to him. And the patriarchs keep insisting, every single one of them, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they keep insisting on being buried in Canaan because they know God will bring his people back there. And this is actually pointing forward to the next chapter that we're going to read in the Bible, which is Exodus. Then in verses 7 to 14, we see a massive funeral procession. So what we see is a huge Egyptian entourage, which basically accompanies Joseph. So we have officials, elders, we have the military, and they all lament deeply, and they bury Jacob in the cave of Machpelah. What you'll notice is Jacob is honored like a king, and the funeral once again reinforces Egypt's admiration for Joseph. And once again, the covenant land is an integral part of the identity of each one of the three patriarchs here. But this scene here is actually closing the story, ending the story of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they're all buried in the land of promise, which was promised to them by God. Now, this is one of the most important verses in the entire Bible, what we see afterwards. Because Joseph's brothers, they fear that they will be put to death, essentially, for what they had done. They threw him into a pit, right? Verses 15 to 17, they are worried. They fear the retribution of their brother. Joseph's brothers actually worry that Joseph is going to take revenge for what they did to him now that Jacob is dead. And they actually send him a message asking for forgiveness. But what's interesting is that their fear actually highlights their lingering guilt that is present within them. And the fact that they still fear shows something else. They actually do not adequately understand Joseph's character. And this is important because this is a fracture in the family that we saw from Genesis 37. But this one statement that comes next is going to set the stage for one of the most theologically dense and important statements in the entire Bible, which is Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Important. Joseph weeps for starters, so he weeps at their fear, and he reassures them, saying, and this is the most important verse in the entire... Okay, not the most important verse, but this is one of the most important theological statements in the entire Bible. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. He compassed them and promises to provide for them and their children afterwards. This is the climax of the Joseph narrative, and Joseph interprets his entire life through the lens of God's sovereignty. He says, evil human intentions do not even come close to limiting God's purposes, and that is critical to understanding Genesis. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And remember, if we take a look, we step back, we understand the bigger picture. Genesis began with human rebellion and ends with God's ability to turn evil into salvation. And this is going to set the stage again for the cross, Jesus Christ. That is to say, the greatest example of humans meaning evil and God meaning it for good. They mocked him, spat on him. And by they, I mean we. We mocked him. We spat on him. We beat him to a bloody mess. He had to carry his cross all the way up to Golgotha by himself. He was nailed. His back was shredded by the whip, the Roman whip, which had metal ball bearings and bone fragments in it. And he died by asphyxiation on a cross. And yet, he meant it for good, because by defeating death, evil, and sin, he rose again. And that is the message of the gospel. And we see it here in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Okay, and then in verses 22 to 23, we see Joseph's final years. Joseph lives to 110 years old. He sees multiple generations of descendants. And obviously he's portrayed as being blessed, fruitful, and honored. And Joseph's long life and his multi-generational family actually signs of God's favor, and it actually implies the promise that God made to Abraham about how you'll be fruitful, multiply, that many nations will be blessed through this one family, and that continues through Joseph's lineage. Final request. Joseph tells his brothers, God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that is Joseph's reminder of the covenant promise that God had made to them. And he makes them swear to carry his bones back to Canaan when God delivers them. Joseph is embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So Joseph dies in faith, but he also remembers the promise that God made. God is going to rescue us from this land. So Genesis ends pointing directly towards the book of Exodus, which is what we will be reading next. And this is important because it helps us identify and understand what's going to happen later in the biblical narrative and how the biblical narrative points towards Jesus Christ and the cross. So, Genesis began with creation, blessing, God's presence, and life in Eden. What does it end with? It ends with a coffin in Egypt, a family awaiting redemption, and a promise of deliverance to the land of Canaan. The whole Old Testament story begins here, and God's people are waiting for God's rescue. And this is all important and allows us to understand the biblical narrative that is going to continue later. Okay, but let's see how we can apply this in our daily life. What we should remember to transform our lives, that we need to forgive like Joseph. True forgiveness refuses to play God. It releases, restores, and speaks kindly. Think about what Joseph said. Think about the way he interpreted his life. He looked at his life through the sovereignty of God. He could have taken things into his own hands. He could have tried to escape slavery and try and defeat his brothers, get revenge as soon as possible, but he trusted God. How can someone trust God in such a radical way like Joseph? Think about Joseph and how he managed to survive through all of this. He completely and radically trusted God, even when it hurt him. He said, I will trust in God. I forgive God. I forgive you all, because what you intended for evil, God intends for good. Now, if you can trust that, if you can believe that what you intended for evil, God intended for good, you will not need to get revenge, because you know that everything works for good for God's greater purposes. That's Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It's like a banging drum throughout the Bible. Do not trust yourself, because you're going to lead yourself into misery. Trust that God will lead all things for good for those who love him. It also is important to trust God in painful chapters. God turned Joseph's slavery into salvation. And He can't redeem your wounds. He can't change your mind, your feelings, your sadness, your depression, your anxiety. He can't change those. But He can change Joseph's slavery into salvation. You have no idea what you're capable of. Because God is the one who is in control in the ultimate scheme of things. And it's important to recognize that you should live with eternity in mind. You should live whilst simultaneously considering the covenant that you have with God. Jacob, Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, all of them, they don't settle for Egypt. They set their hope on God's promise, God's future. So when we do forgive, it's an act of surrender. It's not a denial of pain. And we need to always remember that God can transform the worst human intentions into the greatest of His purposes. And that faith looks beyond what we see right now, beyond the present time. Because Joseph's last words, remember what they were: God will surely visit you. Right? So we need to stop trusting in ourselves and start trusting in the one who conquered death. Genesis ends in a coffin, right? Joseph's embalmed, but it points towards God's future deliverance. And again, we saw this right throughout Joseph's entire story. It's a preview of the gospel. We start with suffering, but that leads to salvation. Exactly like Jesus, how we start the suffering lamb, the lamb that was slain, and that works to salvation for all mankind. So remember, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." The entire Joseph narrative, the entire gospel is contained in this one sentence. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help you keep up your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. I upload daily, so if you don't want to miss tomorrow's episode, feel free to rate the show and follow. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And always remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.